Something about it's a larger system. They just have different metrics of what they build up over time in order to adapt to the changes, if that makes sense. So I think that I really am uncomfortable with separating agriculture from forestry, and really agriculture from all of our land management. I think that there's really good reason to see that all these landscapes have to be healthy and not just agricultural land, but also because it allows all of us to be participants. Every backyard, every small little piece of area needs more TLC, and we'll talk about what that means more specifically. So I guess from the beginning, I'll read a definition of regenerative agriculture that I think is fairly comprehensive. I would maybe add a few things to it, but let's go with that. Regenerative agriculture is a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. Regenerative agriculture aims to capture carbon in soil and above ground biomass, reversing current global trends of atmospheric accumulation of carbon. At the same time, it offers increased yields, resilience to climate instability, higher health and vitality for farming and ranching communities. The system draws from decades of scientific and applied research by the global communities of organic farming, agroecology, holistic management, and agroforestry. That is a statement by a man named Ethan Soloviev, just to give him the credit for that. And I agree with that as a general statement. We can unpack that over the next period of time a bit. I would also emphasize, which may not be really clear in that indigenous communities are very much a part of those communities being mentioned. The wording sounds a bit like it's all research, and there is research within the daily practice of communities all over the world. And so I guess I will also say that 70% of all of the food production on Earth is coming from smallholder, local community, local landholders and small farms, and not even maybe what we would define as farms, but home gardens and just cultural practices that are consumed directly. 70% of the world's food supply is produced by these smallholder farmers on 25% of the agricultural land. So right off the bat, let's maybe take our emphasis off of large scale, chemical farming, which is seriously problematic in terms of the historic erosion of soil. But I'm not going to go into great detail on all the damage of the past few hundred years, but more focus on what are the things that we need to be doing and would have been a lot better had we been doing this a long time ago. And I'll go into what I mean by that. So at the landscape level, as that statement mentioned, improving soil health is a really big deal, and soil carbon in those soils and the soil biology. Just to try to keep this relatively simple today as an introduction rather than going way deep, because there's an endless amount of fascinating emerging information about regenerative agricultural examples and things like that. So also the improvement of watershed. I mean, so really when we get down to this, a lot of what is going wrong has to do with hydrology as hydrological infrastructure. And I would like to springboard off of the last one of these conferences that you did, which talked about the New Green Deal and a lot of those efforts. I think that was a very good, an important topic that's ongoing, and I'd really like to see this develop and be a part of it. So what I guess I want to say about that is, I think that if you look at the last New Deal situation, we're going to be there and way more by the time the next administration comes around. And on a hopeful note, I would like to think that we're going to have more sensibility in the political sphere. However, I've never held my breath on that one in my adult life. But I think there's a good chance that we could see something like that happen. And the way I would summarize what my hopes are on it are that this tremendous amount of people that are going to be homeless and out of work could be hired to do public good as it was done in the original form, but to recognize natural capital or hydrological infrastructure, and that a healthy landscape is actually infrastructure, and have that be recognized. And how that comes out is a lot of tree planting, a lot of riparian zone development, a lot of contour planting of trees to stabilize soil, and this type of thing, ecosystem services. And so the beauty of holistic design, which is really what I'm talking about, is that we can simultaneously solve for really big things that shouldn't be separated, like food security, human health, climate mitigation, kind of the reweaving and regeneration of small communities in general. What we've seen is the really breaking down of the original structures of indigenous tribal societies, but also just even early American dynamics of agrarian communities has been really lost. And we can kind of look, I started off in wildlife biology and really came to an understanding of system health based on habitat qualities that you can measure and you can develop over time, where you can create more of a space for more individuals to exist by understanding habitat dynamics. In other words, it's not a fixed thing that the land holds so many people. It's malleable. We can reduce it, which we have methodically for the last few hundred years, or we can build up that capacity, not only for people, but for all species. That sounds like a tall order, and it is, but I've seen it. I spent 25 years in the jungles of Central America and saw tremendous increases in the capacity of the land to hold life. I've been living off the grid farming here in Southern Ohio for 40 years. And I've seen also a lot of biodiversity coming into the system as a result of this kind of management. So on the individual level, we could also see that a healthy animal or human being is increasing its knowledge in its immune system by constantly measuring and sampling the pathogens in the environment, and many other. Look at some working models. I guess I didn't really give you a background, but I've been doing types of antibodies and T cells and experience of what it really has to deal with to adapt and survive. We also tend to build muscle mass and experience knowledge of our environment. And these are all things that would be regenerative from a post-industrial lifestyle, let's call it, because really the problems that we have are mutual problems. They're not individual ones, and we need to be able to learn how to address these things as a group and to communicate, like this conference, for example. What's fascinating recently is that we're finding that microbes communicate as a group in similar ways. See if I can put this in a nutshell, but one of the things I've been fascinated with lately is Christine Jones, who's a Australian soil scientist, has been, which I would highly recommend. We didn't put the links in there yet on this, but I can add them. Talking about something called quorum sensing, which is basically that microbial populations are self-aware of the size of their group, and they're tied into the whole community of the microbiome. We're talking about soils right now, but it applies equally well to the human gut. The microbiome in our gut and in our skin, and really all through our body, is 99% of the DNA that we have in our bodies. So that 99% community of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so forth, have an ability to communicate among each of their species, but also sense the greater wisdom of what they need to do to keep the organism that they're attached to alive. And so what I mean by that is that in the science of epigenetics, and also if you look at the 1% of us that's human, for example, 90% of the human genome is what originally they called junk DNA, because they couldn't link it to a protein synthesis or something that they were familiar with. So this junk is now beginning to be understood to be a series of very complex switches that can be affected by a whole range of environmental and mental aspects, as well as the microbiome can get involved and change the gene expression if it has enough species and enough population. It seems to, the evidence says that it stays silent, the population stays silent up until they get up to a critical mass. And you could see an analogy to, say, a Me Too movement or a Black Lives Matter movement of the quiet population that's being abused, maybe, is all of a sudden aware of itself as a larger force, and then comes into expression to change those dynamics. I think that's a reasonable analogy and not an anthropomorphism, but I think that the idea is very, very interesting. So part of the next piece, other than soils, is the overall diversity in these systems is critical for its health. And that happens at a number of different levels in the individual, within the genome of the organism, within the microbiome of the organism, also within the totality of organisms in an ecosystem, and the totality of habitat types within that landscape. So if we were to unpack that and start looking at a given landscape and what we could do, we could start seeing a huge influx of pollinators and migratory birds and some of the original animal populations that were here 300 years ago. We can literally restore the qualities for life to thrive. And whether we do that out of a enlightened self-interest, because at the end of the day, the diversity is critical for our individual existence and adaptation, or other benevolent thinking, it doesn't really matter as long as the diversity gets accomplished. It's really quite extraordinary how it works. There was a study in Germany, I believe it's called the Jena or Gina project, and it's been going on for quite a few years, where they have these blocks of land, fairly small, and I think they might be 10 by 10 meters or something like that, and they range from one species up to, I think, 16 and maybe more. And the example I'll mention about that is that what they found is that in a drought condition, all of the plots died except for the ones with more than 8 species in them. So this is a demonstration of how diversity really starts to play out. And what it looks like is happening is that each plant has got different root exudates. And I'll talk about exudates in a moment because it's a really important piece. But the root exudates, and this is a lot of Christine Jones' work, showed just how much of the carbon that a plant sequesters through photosynthesis is represented as exudates into the soil, as opposed to the above ground and the below ground carbon biomass. I was amazed when I saw this, and then it's not a fixed number either. When the plant is got minerals and biology to the right degree, it greatly increases its sharing of nutrition and nutrients with the soil ecosystem, which then in turn shares it back to the plant. And so it's literally an abundance pump. And so what we really want to move toward here is abundance. So all the organisms have their needs met so that conflict and intolerance comes to a minimum. It'll always be there to some degree. I'm not, this isn't a Bambi movie, but we can go a long way toward minimizing suffering and violence. And if we understand the roots of those things, I believe very strongly that they're biological. And there's some very good evidence of different species who have, for example, if you look at bonobos and chimpanzees, the biology of those organisms, you see a lot of similar aggression and violence in the chimpanzee populations, and an amazingly small amount in the bonobo population. So if you unpeel that a little bit and look at the reasons why, it's not just that the one species is more enlightened, it's that the environment that the bonobos live in has a year-round food supply that's abundant, and the chimps live in a place where there's a dry season and some bottlenecks where there's limitation and scarcity of food. So back to the Jena project, it's a good example of how each plant has a separate suite of exudates that are put into the soil. And each plant supports a different group of microbes because of the chemistry that they're sharing. And so by the time you get to 8 plants, you're getting a really wide diversity of plant exudates, which means you have a really wide diversity of microbial activity. And that comes into huge play in terms of benefiting water storage and water efficiency usage, and allowed those plants to survive in the drought. Now, when I said one species versus 8 to 16, they're the same species that died that are in the mixes of 8 plants that survived, which is really interesting because it's showing that the diversity is the key to that resilience. And there's so many other examples of diversity within human communities, within our, like I mentioned, the microbiome, skill sets. We should be not afraid of diversity. We should be just about worshiping it, because it's the thing that gives us the agenda end goals that we really want. So taking to agriculture, I've been looking at a lot of farms, for the last 30 years, looking at a tremendous number of farms and looking at the practices and then the soil tests, for example. And I can be, what's more important to me is less of a snapshot of what they're doing at any given moment, but what they're doing over a period of time and how that's affecting the soil. So there's another large crossover well, let me talk about that a little bit later on the climate piece, because it's a little bit involved. But there's a couple major pieces that I want to address, and one is scale. So I mentioned that 70% of the food is grown on these small farms. Well, there's a number of dynamics that happen on small diversified farms that cannot be really achieved on large scale farms. I use the analogy of a good healer that knows knows that the difference between medicine and poison is dosage. And I would refer to that as a scale lesson. You can't take a good idea and keep ramping it up forever because it's making more money, or and then expect it to perform as it did when it was really at the highest integrity level. We have to understand where that threshold is, which is not a simple thing. We obviously have continually gone over that line historically, and it's really the conditions that are behind the collapse of virtually every civilization. And so we really need to have the metrics as a conscious navigating pattern on our dashboard to understand what we're doing in the world. Because I think our intentions and our effects in the world are not synchronized. I think there's very few people that are really trying to do harm. And they just don't understand the things that they're doing are not consistent with what they hope their relationships to be. Because at the end of the day, this is all about relationships. And we seem to have really missed the boat on the symbiotic relationship option. When there's scarcity, as in the bonobo chimp model, you see that in plants it's similar, where a plant is receiving, it's a bidirectional flow, that through the roots and through the stems there's an upflow of water with nutrients and minerals and the byproducts of biology. And when the plant gets its needs met, let's say, in the form of those minerals and biology, it then can afford to share a lot of its photosynthetic energy that it's making from the sun. And so you see the analogy in human societies, where a person that's not getting enough nutrition and it's not getting enough emotional support and social support gets pretty mean and nasty, and really becomes less capable of sharing. And so the plant does the similar thing, and animals, they tend to get more territorial. The plants can't behave, so what they do is they biosynthesize chemicals, and there's this whole science of allelopathy, which is basically plants producing chemicals that are keeping seeds from germinating, really making kind of a toxic environment. It's like a turf war of gangs or something, where they set up a control system for the resources that are scarce. But if the resources are plentiful, it doesn't need to make those chemicals. And so then there's this larger sharing that can happen. So this is all to say that what we're regenerating is something really quite larger than what we perceive generally as agriculture. It's really our own relationships are being regenerated with life as we know it. And I think it's what we really all long for. So part of this scale issue is that food quality, which is I'm very involved in with this organization I'm working with called the Bionutrient Food Association. We're looking at nutrient density of food, that it's not just bushels per acre, it's what's in those bushels. It's nutrients per acre, rather than just filling bushels full of hollow calories, or even toxic calories, where there's anti-nutrients in a lot of these compounds that we're spraying on food. So the more that you dominate a landscape with a single species, the more vulnerable it is. And it's really a direct relationship. So if you think about a huge field of one crop, and then an insect population that eats that crop gets into it, it can just run like a wildfire right through the population. And it is also, so insects or disease, it's the same deal. There's a fascinating relationship in evolution that you see, that if a predator of an organism is a large predator, the inevitable tendency is for populations of schools of fish, flocks of birds, herds of animals is to bunch together as a response to that predation, right? And so there's a bunching together to survive large predators. But what's less known is that in ecosystems where there's disease and very small pathogens, it's exactly the opposite. If you look at a tropical rainforest or a prairie ecosystem, you'll see that you don't see the same species all bunched together. They're all spread out. They're hard to find two of one in the extreme cases of this. And that's because it's very difficult for the insects or the diseases to locate more than one at a time. And so it's another strategy for protection. I think that's the one we're missing here. And what's happening with COVID-19 is it's unmasking that issue in the human population of extremely high density populations of people with, unfortunately, a simultaneously lowering of their immune systems and more chronic illnesses. It's making for a pretty unfortunate story that isn't confined to the COVID-19 virus. There's an almost endless number of organisms out there that take advantage of sick organisms. You know, in plants, a sick plant is sending out frequencies that insects are tuning into. They will actually not even lay eggs. If a moth that's laying eggs for its larvae to hatch, to eat the leaves of a plant, if that plant's vitality is really high, it's producing secondary compounds that will poison those little caterpillars. And so they're looking for sick plants. They'll fly right by a healthy one. So this is another piece of our design that we need to understand, and we can apply all of these things with a set of observation skills about them. So the scale is also about removing the unnecessary travel and packaging and footprint, energy footprint, resource footprint of a globalized system of food that's moving all over the world and is just based on pricing that does not recognize ecosystem services, soil, air quality, water quality, you know, effects on local communities, health effects on workers in these environments that have lots of toxins being sprayed on them, because it's the only way you can maintain a monoculture, right? Monocultures inherently are going to be vulnerable unless you prop them up with chemicals to keep them alive. So in a large confined dairy operation, for example, the animals live about a quarter as long, and they're constantly being pumped full of antibiotics, very much like, you know, confined human beings are. And it's the, you know, otherwise the illnesses take over. But the problem is the antibiotics have a downside. There's antibiotic resistance of bacteria that then jump to other species, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot at stake here of getting this right. But I think that if we start to look at the resilience of communities, I work a lot with the Amish, and they have a really nicely distributed model of production where every farm is diversified. They are all growing food, they're canning food, they're freezing food, they're storing it. They don't have to run to the store every couple days to go shopping. They're removing all of that travel footprint. And then there's the nutrition of the food that you're picking fresh and eating it directly. You're getting way more nutrition, even if it was really well done, you know, very ecologically grown food, by the time it's traveled 1,300 miles in a package and then sat on shelves until it's sold, it's lost a lot of its nutrition. So I think we need to remember that the reason why we're doing agriculture is for nutrition. And if we want to optimize nutrition, we need to look at local supply chain redevelopment, basically, because it's been, you know, ever since this kind of corporate takeover or delegation to corporations to produce our food for us, we have an inherent deep problem in the fact that there's less than 2% of the population farming, because with those small numbers, there's no way you can do it really right. You know, we're going to need to have a lot more producers as a percentage to consumers. And there's clearly room for specialization, but I think that there's a giant amount of gray area between 1.5% and probably 95% within a community of indigenous peoples that I lived with in Central America. So there's a big piece there. So a bit of an imperative not to just try to find and purchase the right, support the right farmers. That's really important. But we need a lot more farmers to be able to get enough eyes per acre and healthy stewardship and local supply chains so we have food security, which is what we really want. And we have there's no reason why we have to have these vulnerabilities where a big storm comes in and everybody runs to the store and buys all the toilet paper and all the food on the shelves, and, you know, in one day. Every home can be participating in this, whether you're producing anything or not. A lot of this, to me, regenerative agriculture doesn't necessarily speak to food security. And food security involves.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yep.
I'm going to give you the 5-minute warning. And
gotcha. Okay, that went quick.
I knew it would.
Okay, we'll get to most of everything else within the questions, I hope. But I think. Yeah, there's plenty more, but the storage piece is very good. Let me talk a little bit about climate. And also, you know, we have this massive carbon influx into our atmosphere, and we're hearing almost across the board that it's completely about carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. The reality of, at least of the warming part of this story, which is really what's going to threaten us the most, floods, droughts, and fires are all intimately connected to hydrology and temperatures of surfaces, and only about 5% of that is CO2 from fossil fuel burning. I am all for getting rid of fossil fuels, but let's not pretend that we're going to somehow fix the climate by not using fossil fuels. We have basically facilitated the flight of carbon from large forests and prairies and soil carbon and large herds of animals and converted them into the atmosphere. And that's got big problems aside from the temperature issues, like acidification of the oceans and things like that. I included a whole series of links that anyone who's interested can dive so much deeper if they want to into these things. But the power that I'm getting at that we have is to get plant cover, healthy plant cover and diversified plant cover over any bare surfaces. Shade trees over parking lots, and ideally over some of the roofs, and living roofs. A whole, you know, cover cropping is a massive piece of regenerative agriculture. So cover cropping fields, having living roots in the soil for as much of the year as is possible with hardy plants and well-designed year-round covers. So you got food crops, you've got cover crops. Grazing, we could talk a lot about animal grazing. I mentioned the problems with the confined dairies. Well, on the other side of that is our dairies that are 100% grass-fed, and they are the opposite in terms of health. They live 4 times longer. The omega fatty acids in the milk are incredibly more healthy for us, and the soil builds about as fast as anything I've seen of soil building. So yes, it's an ongoing story. I wish I had 10 times longer, but let's open it up for questions so you don't warn me again. And hopefully in questions, we can get at some more of the things that I would have said.
Okay. I just want to let people know that they can type a question in the chat, or they can raise their hand. If you raise your hand, one of the co-hosts will unmute you and will say your name and unmute you, and then you can ask your question. But if you prefer not to ask it and you want to type it in the chat, then I will read the questions that are in the chat. Okay, and we do have a question. And it says, with the need for more eyes on the soil and more small local farms, we need a greater number of farmers and farm workers. How can we encourage people to go into agriculture?
Great question. So if you analyze the supply chains, you'll find that there are processing facilities that are required to get new people into the mix. And so things like creameries and grain mills and meat processing plants, small ones. I have seen so many operations out there that had really good quality grass-fed animal products that had nowhere to send them to have it be organic at the end of that. So they wind up dumping their products on the conventional market at a much lower cost. So another way, that's one, and that's actually a pretty big one. Another way is to unmask or measure the nutrient density of what the small producers can do that the large producers can't. So one of the things that we're developing in the Bionutrient Food Association is a handheld spectrometer that can measure nutrient density in food plants. And it's being calibrated right now. I think it's up to somewhere between 6 and 12 plant species that it can measure. And in the first year of measuring, they found that within polyphenols and antioxidants, one group of nutrients that usually isn't even talked about that much, you tend to have to buy them for large amounts of money in supplement stores, that there was a 200-fold difference in the low nutrition carrot to the highest nutrition carrot that they measured. So you have to eat 200 of these to get to one of these. So there's a whole hidden story in this. And I think that as we go forward with this type of actual measuring of getting the right metrics of the soil health, of the food quality, and also it's going to come out in terms of health issues of what happens in the body when you eat them with all these secondary compounds in them. We're going to see a lot of healing, a lot of value in displaced medical costs, and that it'll be seen that it's a very, very good deal to spend a little bit more money on high quality food, especially if you can measure it. Those are a couple ideas. I think there's quite a few more. I think that we could really explore more in terms of cooperatives and structures that individuals can fit into. I've worked with a number of cooperatives in Virginia that are fantastic, and what happened on their farms as they began to cooperatively produce different crops and market and so forth. That all of their farms, there was about 10 dairies originally, and eventually they started adding vegetables and eggs and poultry meat sorghum molasses, and then they started making raw milk cheeses. And as they diversified, more of the money stayed in the community. So they could, it's really regenerating whole, not just watersheds, but regional economic systems as well. So in order to make room for some more questions, I'll leave it at that, but there's a lot more to that answer.
Okay, I just want to mention that Lori asked, where are the links that Mark has mentioned? And we are going to email those to people that are on tonight, and we're going to have them in the YouTube presentation, so that people that aren't here tonight and see this on YouTube, the links will be available there. Okay. Next question is, I would like to know the story of the peach that Mark grew. Don't know what that means, but.
Okay, good. Yeah, so a hidden piece of the market, what's missing in the commodities, you know, how we turn everything into a commodity. Something got lost in that process. I know it's inevitable and needs to happen, but I think we went too far away from something. So that story had to do with kind of a revelation that I had. I was living for about 10 years in the woods in a little cabin and a teepee in the summer, and I was growing gardens, and I had planted these little peach trees, and, you know, it came to a middle of a winter in this little shack in the woods with about 2 feet of snow on the ground, with a little warm fire going in the stove, and I was looking out the window feeling pretty comfortable, and I reached up and pulled a quart of peaches off the shelf that I had grown and canned, and I took a bite of those peaches in that moment, and all of it kind of washed over me. You know, the thunderstorms and the rainbows, and the, you know, watching these little trees grow from seedlings into big trees and peaches, and there was some kind of a qualitative connection in that moment that I think has gotten lost in our commodity economy, and where we're actually restoring quality. Part of the quality that we're involved in is because of our involvement in that product. And so I realized that you could be the richest person in the world and couldn't buy one taste of those peaches. You know, that's a qualitative thing that's part of your own, weaving your own life into a supply chain of some type. It's not just about peaches. It could be about anything. It could be about, you know, social interactions. It could be services that you're providing to others and seeing this a really positive result in another person because of the caregiving or healing or whatever. Just handing somebody some food and seeing the look on their face or the response at the farmer's market, you know, the following week after they tell you what happened when they ate it, etc. So okay. That's it in a nutshell, but I think it's a pretty important point that gets lost in the economic exchange.
Absolutely. I know you mentioned about not letting bare soil be exposed to cover it with foliage. Besides that, or expand on that, what should we be doing in the suburbs to help regenerate the soils?
Yes, that's good, because I think the suburbs and in the urban environment, I worked you know, in over about an 8-year period. We did 3 permaculture design courses in Cleveland and really looked at how, you know, a whole region could be developed. And we looked at some of the work that Kent State did in city planning, and we looked at the flight of the population from its heyday and where the green belts could be, and, you know, travel could happen. So, but back to that question, you can increase diversity in that landscape. You can plant pollinator plants. You can become part of a migration of hummingbirds that has to get all the way down to at least Mexico, and they need nectar all the way down. You could be involved in that, or in migratory bird habitat and understanding where the bottlenecks are in the phenologies or the timing of flowering and fruiting. You can identify the times of the year when there's a real lack of nectar for bees or fruit for birds, and you can plant species that fill that gap, right? We're doing a similar thing for ourselves and the human communities as well. It's planting food plants to provide fresh food as much of the year as possible for people. You can put a high tunnel in. I mean, we could go all night on all the things that we could do, and this is really the basics of a permaculture design. What you tend to do is to look at all the resources you have. Look at the land, how much land you have, what kind of soil, what's the space, and then you optimize with the community that you live in. Very often in the suburbs and the urban areas, you have more social capital than you have natural capital, and you have to work with that. And it's another resource. I work also, I didn't mention, but one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen humans do through history in terms of a lasting positive result in the soil is a story from the Amazon of terra preta soils, where they found these black earth soils that are 6.5 feet deep, and in a place where it's so hot that organic matter, carbon, oxidizes, and it's very hard to keep around. It goes into the air. It basically breaks down. But what they found were these black soils were fundamentally different than the natural soils, which were very poor. And as they studied them more, they found that they were man-made soils. They're anthropogenic soils. And the key to them, it's a little bit complex, but the main key piece is charcoal or biochar. And you can make biochar in your backyard. I've got a fire pit that's just, it's an inverted steel iron pyramid shape with about 1 foot open at the bottom, which sits in the soil, and you've put firewood in there, and the flame kind of blocks the oxygen from the coals so that it can't burn all the way to ash. And then it's got a cooking grill that goes over it, so you can hang out with your neighbors and basically do a clean burn where there's very little smoke. And there's many other ways of making biochar, which are generally hotter fires, less smoke, and you only burn it to the charcoal point, and then you stop it so that you maintain the carbon, the charcoal. If you look in the archaeological digs and you see these really ancient cultures and you see their fire pits, there's charcoal still there in them. It's an amazing leverage point for keeping carbon in the biosphere, in the soil, where it serves all the living things, the fungi, the bacteria, the whole soil food web is enhanced by it. So I'm beta testing, for example, one of the first of its kind, a wood burning gasification system that makes electricity. Because I'm off the grid, I don't have much sun in the winter months, and so I can charge my batteries from the Stirling engine generator part of that heat from the wood, and also heat water to cool the Stirling engine so that it has a differential of temperature. And so I'm getting hot water, which turns into space heat, and hot water for the house while making charcoal. So this is going from wood, and the wood can be extracted. This is the long form of this story is in one of the links that we've provided. It's a 2.5-hour presentation with all the slides and graphs and much more detail. But yeah, composting, worm beds, gardens, pollinator plants, trees to shade. Like I said, if there's any sun hitting the ground, or if you can get to anything that you can make shade, it turns into a major transformation of how heat is transferred to the upper atmosphere, and it's captured by water. 95% of that heat capture is really happening within water. And so it's a complex thing. We also have 2 links that are highly recommended in the list. One is the Michael Kravchuk New Water Paradigm that goes into the details of how we can store water, and also how we can cool the planet. And there's also catching water off of your roof. If you're in the suburbs, you can do rain gardens and capture water so it infiltrates into the soil or into a pond. But catching and slowing water down before it gets to the ocean. A lot of the violence of water is in fast-moving runoff that's taking soil away with it. And so what you want to do is gently absorb, get the water infiltration capacity of soils is a very good metric on the health of soils. Is there other questions, or we're running out of?
Yeah, I'm going to ask another one from Justin. Do you know of any carbon negative plants that could be incorporated in either farming, gardening, or large scale planting? Miscanthus, which is a tall grass, is carbon negative, but I'm curious if there are any others.
Well, almost any plant can be carbon negative in the sense that, especially with what I mentioned about the liquid carbon pathway, if you can get the minerals and the connectivity of that plant to mycorrhizal fungi, it has access to not only the A horizon soil, but the B and C horizon soil, and much more water. And then that liquid carbon will be pumped into the soil. It's not just, again, it's, we tend to look at the biomass of a plant, of the top growth and the root growth, where a healthy plant is producing a lot of carbon into the soil that's not measurable by measuring the plant, if that makes any sense. And so, yeah, I tend to be looking at integrating coppicing plants. So trees that have deep root systems that might fix nitrogen, like black locust, where you can grow them in among other crop plants, and they'll enhance the nitrogen to those crop plants and shade other plants that can handle some shade. And then when they get to be too much shade, you cut them off, and then you have firewood or biochar wood or any number of other possible energy uses. And you manage that shade. You cut the coppicing, for people who don't know what it is basically the kind of the cutting and re-sprouting of the roots of the tree, that you can get a huge amount of biomass from. And again, if you're leveraging that with making biochar from it, you're getting this massive, probably 100 times if you were just to, let it break down and oxidize within, say, within 20 years, instead of 20 years, hundreds to possibly thousands. So you can do that with miscanthus, and you can do it with like all sorts of plants, but lot to unpack in that in that conversation there, and it's a really important one. Using plants to bring down carbon as opposed to scrubbing coal plants and pumping carbon down deep in the soil where it's doing no good, with a lot of energy, versus just optimizing plant health and landscape architecture, the many layers of structure that you can have in a landscape, not just a single layer of one plant, but lots of plant stacking above and below ground. Different shapes of root systems below ground can be packed together in ways that the same one would hit limitations much sooner. So you get real deep tap roots and medium branch roots, and then fibrous roots next to each other, and then the tops similarly, right? So the limits on this stuff have definitely not been found, and we have a lot of collective citizen science experimentation to do here.
Okay, this question is from Ron. Can you comment on the urban garden movement? Is this trend growing, and how much is it helping the environment in urban populations, like those folks in food deserts?
Another good question. Yes, it seems to be on the increase, and I think that this. I mean, it's been a while since I worked with some friends in Cleveland again with a lot of the community gardens there, and also down in Atlanta and other places. And I think when you're looking at having the community connectivity and the food security, the conversations that tend to happen in these gardens, saving seeds and that conversation and swapping and sharing and figuring out what the needs in that community are, go way beyond the food piece of it. I think that having a green oasis of sanity in a concrete jungle is massively healing. There's also the displacement of when you look at the food that's coming in, and again, the packaging and the travel and the food that's being produced not only has all these community aspects and it's fresher and it's it's got multiple layers of value beyond maybe the ecological green that it's producing, but absolutely important. I mean, I think people in the city need access to, healthy growing biological landscapes more than probably any other group. And so it's kind of like I guess there is a term called horticultural therapy. And so that's not a minor piece of all of that. But, I think if you look to some of the other countries like France and, rings of production around the cities, there can be a series of linkages between the inner city and suburbia and then the more rural areas where there's a kind of a cooperative communicative thing going on that you can build markets into place where people know what they're growing, who they're growing it for, and a lot of, there's an interesting word called disintermediation, which is basically taking out the middleman. And there's a lot of efficiencies in that. Again, I think that if you were to compare, say, a square mile of Holmes County in Ohio or Lancaster County in Pennsylvania with the Amish, and look at the resilience in a food bottleneck, in a food security context, it would be really hard to compete with. However, I think there's real potential for somebody at one point did some calculations that if all of the lawns in the United States were transformed into food production, we would have everything we need for food. I don't know how that deals with something like oil plants and some things that really require large areas, and we have large areas. There's been some interesting proposals for like Buffalo Commons in like an 8-state area in the Midwest the population has been actually fleeing. And so there's almost an endless amount of possibilities. I know we jumped from the urban conversation there, and I'd be happy to develop that. And this might be a time that there was a discussion we talked about doing some work with a couple properties and maybe making that process available to a larger group that was interested. I'd be happy to come up and work with that process. So maybe we could discuss that going forward. But there's quite a bit to work with. I mean, there's almost, I can't think of anybody that has nothing to work with. There's nowhere close to being optimized anywhere I've been. So there's lots of room for progress and hope and improvement.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Linda is going to call on someone who has their hand up.
Okay.
And that's Kim.
Okay. Yes, I am interested in turning my yard into a food production, like permaculture, like food forest, an edible food forest. And I've been reading about it a lot, and they recommend that you use a lot of perennial plants because it's easier to maintain. But it doesn't sound like we have necessarily a lot of like perennial vegetable plants here. I mean, you've got asparagus and there's like New Zealand spinach and stuff, but apparently around the world there's a lot. What do you think about using these non-native perennial plants in like a suburban little mini food forest?
Yeah. I am not a rabid non-native plant person. I think we do want to make sure we're weaving in plenty of native plants. And there's a couple things I would mention. There's a book called Around the World in 80 Plants. I think that is basically looking at a lot of the perennial vegetables. There's a number of, let's see, Dave Jackie's books. I don't know if you've seen his books. Let's see. Oh, there's a lot of them. If give me a little time, or when I mean, your property and Doreen's property is the one that we're talking about. If the two of you want to share this process, we can develop a reading list and a resource list, and maybe even share some of the designs that we come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if anybody on this meeting is interested in learning about this, and we do it here at my house, they're welcome to join the sessions, you know, as we develop this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot to work with there. Okay, one thing I will say about the native, non-native thing is that there's a biologist named Doug Talamay. I think he's got a new book out, and he was like looking at it, and mostly I think in suburban type landscapes. He was watching what birds were bringing back to the nest for the young birds, and he put cameras on them, and he looked at how many caterpillars, because it's all about caterpillars, the fats and the easy to digest aspect of caterpillars is the gold standard for raising baby birds. And the number of caterpillars was absolutely stunning, how many it requires. And what he did from that is he made a list of the trees in the area and how many species of caterpillars that each tree supports. What he found was that oaks were like at the very top, like over 500 species. This is in Maryland or Delaware. And that, you know, some introduced tree species were zero, like ginkgo. You know, ginkgo has some value, but not for caterpillars. But the important thing here is it's not to say you don't plant non-natives. It's that you need to have, I think it was right about 30%. When you go over 30% of your trees in an area are non-native, you go into a population sink. The population starts diminishing of your birds. So it's very good to have these observation skills and to be communicating with others and optimizing for diversity. So which species you plant matters in that regard. If you're in a situation where you're approaching 30% or more non-natives, you better be planting natives.
Okay.
That's one example that I think is relevant there. But otherwise, I think it's really about looking at how you can become more self-reliant on your space and the different categories of nutrition and how to achieve that.
Okay, thank you, Kim. There's a comment from Glenn, and he's just suggesting a book by Dave Jackie, Jacke, Edible Forest Garden Design. Are you familiar with it?
That's what I just mentioned. Yes, when she asked me, I said Dave Jackie. That there's some other good ones we can come up with, yeah.
It might be helpful to if off the top of your head you could just name a couple.
Well, one resource that I like, it's not so much in the design, but a book called Cornucopia by Stephen Fasciola. It gives you thousands of species to choose from, and it describes them and what parts of the world they come from, and how, and enough information to match them up with similar parts of the world as you're in, right? So you can kind of match a place in China that's the same elevation and maybe rainfall and things like that, and frost-free days, and get all kinds of ideas about food plants that you didn't even know were options. That's one that I tend to like. There's Sturtevant's Edible Plants of the World along those same lines. I mean, we could go way down the rabbit hole on plant diversity and look at how to think about that, and seed saving and grafting and different types of plant propagation systems. But accessing, one of the nice things about cornucopia is that it gives you all these commercial sources for accessing plant material, but it also has botanical gardens and government collections and other ways of accessing these plants. And that's another really powerful thing you can do in a suburban yard, is create these collections that can be propagated, because once you have them, you can replicate them and propagate them to all the other suburban properties. And if you get synchronized with a group of people where everybody has different things, you can really multiply the effect of that.
Okay. April actually is asking a question that I don't know is in the scope of this program, but she says, I would like to know what plants I ought to grow in my suburban homestead. I have partial shade. I live in Lakewood, and she would like to grow medicinals, food, and pollinators. So books like this would be a good resource for her, correct?
Yes, but we haven't made a plug yet for United Plant Savers. I'm on the advisory board of that organization, and there's a plant sanctuary down here in Southern Ohio that's a phenomenal collection of native medicinal plants. It's focused on conservation of medicinal plants, and particularly strategies to keep a lot of the endangered ones from going extinct, with different strategies of more people growing them out, creating plant sanctuaries all over the country, and then having them to be accessible for propagation as well. There's some very interesting plants that kind of start to blur the lines between food and medicine, because really any healthy plant is medicine essentially. But there's some other plants, kind of these Japanese mountain vegetables and Chinese mountain vegetable type things. There's a guy in North Carolina in the mountains that's putting a pretty impressive collection together of those. One of them is called Jiao Gulin. It's very easy to grow in a shady place. It's a vining perennial cucurbit, meaning that it's related to cucumbers and squash, and it has 5 leaflets, and it has at least 5 of the ginsenoside chemical compounds that ginseng does. And you can eat it, you can make tea, you can just keep picking it because it's a rapidly growing vine. So that is an example of something. But I think with a little more of a conversation about what rings your bell, we could develop a much longer plant list there. Certainly things like golden seal and ginseng and a lot of the forest medicinals, depending on how much shade you have, a lot of those can be done. We didn't talk about mushrooms, but you can grow very medicinal mushrooms, and there's a whole conversation of medicinals that are very relevant for this, not just COVID-19, but radically reducing your vulnerability to viruses. I would refer to Stephen Herod Buhner. He's been writing a lot about not only COVID-19, but plant-based antibiotics that are alternatives to antibiotics. And in general, there's just a real gold mine of very good herbalists out there in this country. And a lot of them cycle through the United Plant Savers organization. So
before I forget, Linda asks, who is the author of Cornucopia?
Stephen Faciola, I believe it's Facciola, like Stephen. I think it's pronounced more like Ephen, if I remember right. You'll find it.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay, I just want to check if anybody has their hand up, and I don't see I don't see anybody with their hand up. Just looking to see if there's a question that we haven't asked. I actually have a question. I have a compost pile. In fact, I put all my food scraps in my compost pile, but it's mostly green, not brown, because I don't have enough leaves. So it's pretty much anaerobic. Is that the right term? And could you talk a little bit about if there are any cons, pros and cons to that kind of compost pile? Because I'm not meticulous about the proper percentages of green to brown, but my food is not going in the landfill, so my food scraps, so that's a plus. But as far as putting it in my garden, is that beneficial or not?
Yeah, it's beneficial. I mean, if you're not having rat or insect problems,
No.
or neighbors complaining about smells and things like that, you can, again, you can do earthworm beds, which will rapidly cycle those nutrients and give some very unique compounds coming out of the back end of an earthworm. Urban chickens is another way. I believe Cleveland's got, I don't know what part of where exactly you are up there, but you can do backyard chickens there. You could just bury it in the garden beds.
That's what I used to. I was going to ask you that. That's what I did that for years. I just went around and put it in.
Yeah, there's a lot of options of how to get that done. Some of the rock powder minerals, which are very good for your garden and your soils, when you add it into a composting process, does accelerate the microbial activity and speeds up that breakdown and gives you a more mineralized compost.
What kind of powders are those?
I bring in some very unique minerals. One called carbonatite from Canada. I believe I'm the only person in the U.S. that is bringing it in. It's incredible. It's very rare. It's very unusual. But the more typical ones are basalt. If you get a finely powdered basalt or granite dust, or I'm in a conversation with some people composting in Northern Ohio about locating some quarries of glacial gravels and getting that ground into a powder. The nice thing about glacial gravels is that they're very diverse rock types all mixed together by the glaciers and the alluvial movement of water. And theoretically, you're going to get a pretty valuable rock dust out of that. So there's some work to be done on scouting out quarries and looking at, which ones have glacial gravels, and particularly ones where the rock powders are piling up under the conveyor belts and they want it to be hauled away, sometimes for free. So I mean, that's a really ideal situation there. But there's an interesting book called The Survival of Civilization by John Hamaker that was back in the 1980s. There's another one called Bread from Stones about rock powders. Another one of our Ohio, a friend of mine who passed away, named Harvey Lyle. He wrote a book called The Enlivened Rock Powders. So it's a very interesting piece, because minerals are what you're, when you're growing plants constantly, or you're cropping in an agricultural setting over and over, and you're removing a lot of crop material, you're taking off up to 50 different micronutrients, and a lot of times people are just putting NPK back in. And there's downsides to water soluble, particularly nitrogen, and phosphorus, in terms of the algae growth, overgrowth in Lake Erie and so forth. The organic slow release forms of these things don't cause those problems. And so this is what you want, is slow release, so the plants get it and it doesn't get taken away by your heavy rains and washed into the streams and wind up, creating dead zones somewhere all the way down the Mississippi to the dead zone off of New Orleans or in the western basin of Lake Erie. These are fixable problems.
Okay. We are winding down with our time. And so I'm going to ask if anybody has a question that they would still like to ask, to please raise your hand and we'll call on you. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we need to announce. We are going to discuss maybe bringing Mark back and talking about some of these other aspects a little more in detail. And we'll, let everybody know what comes of that. And I don't see anyone's hand raised. So I think we're going to end on time. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight on a beautiful Friday night in Cleveland. And we are going to post this on YouTube. It'll take a few days to get it programmed, for the YouTube platform. And we'll have the link on our Facebook page. And we will email the list of resources that Mark provided to everybody who's on tonight. Mark, thank you so much. We enjoyed being just amazed at all these different aspects of life that we just are not usually in touch with. So thank you so much. We appreciate your work and you being.
My pleasure. And yes, I wouldn't even mind putting, if you have a place for a contact on your list of my email, if people have questions or want to, go into.
Oh, yeah, we'll definitely do that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you. Thanks again. And everybody have a good night.
You too. Thank you again. Okay, good night, everybody.